So, on behalf of the Schiller Institute in Denmark and also on the Copenhagen Bureau of the Executive Intelligence Review, I want to greet everybody and tell you we are happy to see you here. This is our first physical event in a long, long time. And we decided, because of the urgency of the matter at hand, the situation in Afghanistan, that we would very quickly pull together this seminar because we had the opportunity to get some very prominent guests to speak for us. Because as we see it, first of all, we have an extremely urgent situation in Afghanistan. We have a humanitarian catastrophe beyond belief that is developing right now if the world is not working together to deal with it. But at the same time, it is also a very pregnant moment in human history, because the pullout of the US troops from Afghanistan and the total collapse of the US or Western-backed and trained forces there within a very short period basically collapsed the whole fairy tale, or the whole what they call the narrative of what has been going on in Afghanistan over the last 20 years of rebuilding democracy and all of these imaginative ideas, but also is an expression of the same process going on in general in huge, large parts of Southwest Asia. And when all of this came to be, the president of the Schiller Institute, Helga Seppler-Rouge, basically came out and says, this is not, people come out and say this is like the Saigon moment, this is like the US pulling out of Vietnam, but that's not the right parallel. This is like the collapse of the Berlin Wall. This is the end of an era. And with the end of an era, the question immediately comes, well, what then will be the new era to come? What will be in it? And what we have been doing in the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche forces for many, many decades, for half a century, is to answer the question, once one system, one paradigm collapses, to already in advance define what should then follow next. And our answer has been to say, well, instead of thinking what should be the next phase of chaos and war to follow in Afghanistan or in Southwest Asia or in the world in general, the question should be, how do we right now build peace through development? How do we, out of these very, very tragic circumstances, use the opportunity to replace the old paradigm with geopolitical considerations, with the question of how can we annoy the others? A little bit like the moment you had with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, when Europe had been at war for 100 years, with all kind of religious war and political wars and this and that, just one war following the other. When the governments of Europe realized that if we continue this, there will be nobody left to report about it. So therefore, we have to sit together and find out a way to live together where we respect each other's countries or religions and whatever you have. And instead of thinking about how can we sabotage what the others are doing, then we want to have the principle of how can we help our neighbors. And this choice has not been made. I mean, in Denmark right now, Denmark being since 1999, having gone from participating in peacekeeping operations, Denmark made a switch and instead went into a militaristic foreign policy, basically joining every single war around, despite being only 5.8 million people. Now in Denmark, there's a reflection saying this was an utter failure. What now? And we want to make sure that this what now comes on a totally new level in terms of what should be part of this. So, of course, we should not continue with what did not work. We now know that you cannot solve problems through military means. But we also now have to, in the different nations, Denmark most emphatically included, have to have this idea, well, if we are to solve these things, this is going to be through collaboration. And it's going to be through collaboration with all the neighbors, all the participants, of course the United States, but also of course China, of course Russia, and so on. So that being said, I will present our speakers that we are very proud to have here today. We have first Hussein Askary, who is the Schiller Institute Southwest Asia Coordinator. He is the author of The Dawn of Geoeconomics, Extending the Belt and Road to Afghanistan, and has been co-authoring a lot of these very, very beautiful reports we've been making about how to develop the new Silk Road. Then we have a guest coming in here from Italy, Professor Pino Arlacchi, who has also a very elaborate and long CV, but in this capacity, in his long career, has been the Executive Director of the United Nations Office for Drug Control and Crime Prevention from 1997 to 2002, and in that function negotiated an almost total elimination of opium production in Afghanistan with the Taliban before 2001, and I think you're going to also tell us something about that. And also a former EU rapporteur on Afghanistan, and now a professor of sociology at the School of Political Science at the University of Sassari in Italy. So he will speak next, and then we'll have also a speech by His Excellency Ahmad Farouk, Ambassador of Pakistan to the Kingdom of Denmark since 2020, who has also, I think, for a long time been involved, especially for Pakistan in the United Nations and in also dealing with the issues of counterterrorism, peace and security. So the idea is basically that we'll let the speakers give presentations which we will stream, and then we'll shut off the live stream. We'll still do recordings, so later with the permissions of those involved. If something important that we afterwards can put out, then we will put out, but we'll put out nothing without having proper authorization from those saying what they said. So people...
We'll put out the answers.
We'll put out the answers, but again, we do it like that because we do appreciate a free and frank discussions. People should speak their mind and not, like it's very common, just say what they think other people would like to hear them saying. So with that, I think Hussein, I'll pass the microphone to you, very physically here.
Okay. Just 1 minute.
And we'll have plenty of time for discussion after the presentation. So write down your questions, make sure you have them, keep them.
Okay, some technical issues here.
Can I just use this for 1 minute?
Okay, have the whole thing?
This is for the Zoom people. We will be cutting off the Zoom before the discussion. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat during the presentations, and then I will try to ask them. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here back in Copenhagen. Your Excellency, Ambassador Ahmad Farouk, and Professor Pino Arlacchi. It's a great honor for me to share this panel with you. As Tom said, just a general outline for our discussion is that we are not here to analyze things. We are here to start a process, a development process, which Mrs. Helga Septarush, the chairwoman of our Schiller Institute, launched already in July, even before Taliban took over, because she realized that the end of the game has come and that there's a new paradigm that should replace the old failed paradigm, as everybody could see for themselves. Now, I will be focusing on three parts in my presentation. The first one is on the humanitarian catastrophe. The second one will be on the failure of geopolitics. And then we go more in detail into what we think is the solution, the way to go forward concerning not only Afghanistan, but whole Eurasia and world politics. So there is a very cynical...
The map is on your face.
Okay.
To the left or the right?
Yeah. Okay, we can turn it on at the moment. There's a very cynical game being played by the same forces who had occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, and then they left the country completely in ruins. Now they say, look, after cutting all the financial aid to Afghanistan, the United States have frozen $9 billion of the money of the government of Afghanistan. It's not the money of Taliban. It is for the government and state of Afghanistan to be able to import food, electricity, medicine, and all things. Now they say, look, Taliban are incapable of governing because there is famine, there is chaos, hospitals are closed, there is no electricity, there is no food, there is no medicine. Look, the Taliban cannot govern. And that's a very, very cynical attitude, which we have to reverse very quickly, because what is at stake is not the Taliban. What is at stake is 39 million people in Afghanistan who very few people talk about. Now, some people try to blame everything on the Taliban to cover for their own failure, because why a country after 20 years and $2.5 trillion spent cannot grow its own food, cannot have hospitals, cannot produce its own electricity, and there is shortage of water, there is shortage of everything. So to cover for their failure, those forces are saying, look, the Taliban is a failed state. Afghanistan is a failed state. But I hope this will not happen, as I will explain. Now, as recently international aid organizations, but especially the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program, have said that there are 14 million people in Afghanistan immediately threatened by famine. That they're hungry already, but 4 million are threatened by famine. That those people can perish, they can die if there isn't enough food sent to them. We have tens and maybe hundreds of small clinics were closed because international organizations were pulled out, abandoned their work there. These centers are closed, although they are very small, but they presented some services to the population. We have now even the Food and Agriculture Organization saying that probably we have missed the farmers in Afghanistan at the end of September. Probably they missed to sow the seeds for the winter wheat harvest, the winter wheat production. So this is an additional, because the farmers need the seeds to come from outside the country to plant the seeds. Now, many hospitals will not be able to provide services because guess what? Afghanistan imports 80% of all electricity from neighboring countries. Now, with the freezing of the assets of the government, they cannot pay the bills of electricity to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, and they cannot pay for the food which was coming from Pakistan, which was the biggest exporter of food to Afghanistan. So the whole country is in a total disaster, and this has to be prevented immediately. So we should remove the cynicism, the cynical view that let there be chaos, so we can prove to everyone that Taliban have failed, Taliban's neighbors have failed. But I don't think this is going to happen this way. But I think for the United States, for the NATO countries, and for the EU, there is a way back from that failure by contributing to remedying this disaster, allowing the aid to go back, unfreeze the money which the Afghanistan government can use, and collaborate with Afghanistan's neighbors, with China, with Russia, with Pakistan, Iran, all these neighbors, to rebuild Afghanistan's economy, as I will explain. So now that's an immediate priority for both us, the Schiller Institute, but it should be a priority for everyone to mobilize to stop that. Now, the other aspect of this is the failure of geopolitics. I will try to stay away from the screen. So. Anyway, what Tom said, Mrs. Helge Sepp-LaRouche said, this is not Saigon 1975, this is the Berlin Wall 1989, because we had an era which has ended. And hopefully, the era of geopolitics, which extended for 200 years, probably is ending in the same place where it was born. The Great Game was born in Afghanistan when the British Empire, and this is a very valuable book, it's called The Great Game. This is one of the first books I was given in the Schiller Institute in the 1996 when I joined. And it details how the British Empire played Afghanistan as a buffer against Russia. And all Afghanistan's border were created by British officers, intelligence officers, who made agreements with tribal chiefs in different parts of, especially in this area around the Panjshir River. All these were creations of the British to make, because they could not control Afghanistan. The British lost 3 wars in Afghanistan in 1839-42, in the 1870s, and in 1919. They invaded Afghanistan, but they could not keep it. So they turned Afghanistan into a buffer. And if you look at the topography of Afghanistan, it is a natural barrier between the north and the south. So the British used that. And the very person, the British intelligence officer who coined the term the Great Game, Arthur Connolly, he was beheaded in Bukhara in Uzbekistan because he was disguised as a Muslim merchant, and he was caught spying there. And he ended up being beheaded by the governor, the emir of Bukhara. But my point is that in the same place where geopolitics, the destructive geopolitics, or the Great Game started, can end now. And that failure we saw not only in the whole Soviet era, the mobilization of the so-called Mujahideen against the Soviet army in the 80s, which had also catastrophic results, but then we had a civil war as a result of that in the whole 90s, the Taliban come in, and then now we have had, since 2001, a catastrophic new page in that history of geopolitics, which we believe it can end now. So I usually don't like to talk about numbers of victims, but it gives an idea about the enormous suffering which was created since 2001, both in Afghanistan but also in Iraq and other countries who were regime changed in a sense. So we have these numbers. There's a project in the Brown University in the United States called The Cost of War. I have written an article about what these wars have cost. And it's a massive suffering of the civilian population in Afghanistan. Now, some people told me these are conservative numbers, but these are what are documented. We had 270,000 civilians killed, both Afghanistan and Pakistan, because Pakistan also suffered from this war. We had 73 Afghan soldiers killed. We had 2,298 and 3,904 American so-called contractors. These are mercenaries. Also killed. But then look at the massive, there are 30,000 American soldiers or veterans committed suicide after going home. Now you can also imagine the enormous suffering of their families, of the community where they live. There are 2.5, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, it says that there are 2.5 million refugees from Afghanistan in neighboring countries, mostly in Pakistan and in Iran. I think this is also a conservative number. There is also 3.5 million people internally displaced because of the civil war, all the other conflicts. They had to move, especially people moved to the big cities, creating even more misery. And then we had the financial cost of the war in Afghanistan, $2.2 trillion. And this is an enormous amount of money. And there was nothing built in Afghanistan all these 20 years. All this money was used on fighting, on weapons, on soldiers, and also on corruption, fostering corruption in the community. But totally, since 2001, all the wars the United States was involved in cost $10 trillion. And this is an incredible, I tried to quantify it in my head, what you can do with $10 trillion, you can build 17 times China's high-speed railway network, 30,000 kilometers. You can build 17 such networks with the $10 trillion. You can build 322 Three Gorges dams in the world, producing 6,400,000 megawatts of power. This is what the world needs, actually. 6,400,000 megawatts of electricity. This is what you need to cover every person on the planet, that they will have electricity in their home. This is what these wars have cost. But none of this was used. So I wrote an article about the cost of war and the cost of construction. I compared all the disasters the United States have been involved in and NATO to the China's Belt and Road Initiative. With only less than $1 trillion, China built thousands of kilometers of railways, power plants, ports, airports, agricultural projects, industrial zones, and so on and so forth, with less than 10% of what was spent on these wars. So in this sense, we have come to this is the third section of my presentation, which is, as Biden said, this is the end of an era. So what is coming after that era? And Mrs. Helga Septaruch said, it's the era of peace through economic development. And the best model we have is the Belt and Road Initiative, because that thing works. It has proven it works. China's own massive economic and industrial development is a proof of the method of how to finance and build infrastructure, pull people out of poverty. China pulled 800 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. So in any case, but this idea of connecting the whole world, not creating two camps, one is China, Russia, and one is the West. This has been the concept of our Schiller Institute since the 1990s. So we are not analyzing things, we are campaigning. We are lobbying to change the world policy, and therefore all these years as we have produced all this material, we have been in dialogue with governments, we have been in dialogue with think tanks, with engineers, with companies, and so on and so forth, to make sure that people both understand the importance of connecting nations, regions, and continents for their own economic prosperity, but also as a means to establish peace among nations. Now, Afghanistan, now the green lines are the Belt and Road Initiative lines, the different corridors proposed by China. But the rest, including the Belt and Road, is our ideas, how to connect the continents and include every country in that development. Now, in the past 20 years, now people ask me, how can you know that the Taliban have changed? I said, I have no idea if Taliban have changed. I'm not a Taliban expert. What I know is that the world around Afghanistan has changed. That's what I know, and that's what I've been working with. Because if you look at the region around Afghanistan, especially the China-Pakistan economic corridor, is creating an economic revolution in the country, although people are in a hurry to harvest the benefits and say, oh, okay, where is it? That's a massive development program between China and Pakistan, just south to the border of Afghanistan. To the north of the border, you had the new Silk Road, the Iron Silk Road, but also there has been a very big shift in the Central Asian countries to work with Russia and China, but mostly with China, and become the bridge between East and West, because many nations in Central Asia and the Caucasus were told, if you don't work with Russia, if you don't work with China, if you don't work with Iran, we will help you get your oil and gas somehow, somewhere to the West. It didn't happen. There's a physical, geographical reality. You cannot jump over that reality. And therefore now, Central Asia is oriented towards Asia. Even Iran is oriented towards China with this strategic agreement they signed last year, but the new president of Iran has also indicated very clearly that going east is the product. But all these years, all these things happening, Afghanistan is not touched by it. There's no development inside Afghanistan under NATO-US control. So the country was almost sealed away from its environment, natural environment. And what happened is like exactly also what happened in Iraq. You had the failure of Western politicians, not only in grasping strategic issues, but understanding economy. So they told the Afghans, okay, you need electricity, here is some money, you can buy electricity from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Iran. You need food, here is some money, you can buy food from Pakistan. You need medicine, here is some money, you can buy medicine from China. So they think they can solve everything with money. So now what happens when the money is not there? Why not get the Afghanis to build power plants in their country so they can produce their own electricity? There is a lot of hydropower potential, there is coal, and so on and so forth. Why not build some power plants in Afghanistan using a little tiny bit of the war budget? Why not allow the Afghanis to grow food instead of opium? I'm not going to discuss the opium question because Professor Arlacchi is going to discuss it. So all these years, Afghanistan was, while things are happening around it, Afghanistan was left behind in this process. So another thing which has happened, which very few people in the West have grasped, is that this orientation to the East, but it's not really just an orientation to the East. Now, last month there was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization were preparing for the US and NATO withdrawal long time. They were prepared to step in case the United States and NATO completely abandon Afghanistan. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was initially a security cooperation organization, have now become a security but also economic cooperation organization. And now, last month, Iran was admitted as a full member. The countries in dark green are the full members, the light green are observers. But last month, Iran was admitted as a full member in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So you have a physical block, a geographical block from China, including Russia, including India, Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, all the way to the borders with Turkey, a NATO member, but the Turks are getting more and more frustrated by the US and the West, and they are moving slowly to reorient towards Russia or China. You have even in the Caucasus. So you have a huge uninterrupted block of nations where you don't have British intelligence spies or American troops in between them. This is very, very important. Those nations now can work freely to establish a stronger economic unity, but also use that to secure the situation. Now people say, well, first you have to have security, then you can build the economy. Wrong. You have to build the economy to be able to stabilize the security situation. In Pakistan, you had many attacks on the Chinese companies and Pakistani engineers who are building the infrastructure in the CPEC projects. But the prime minister decided to go ahead. You cannot stop building the economy, because if you stop it, then the terrorists will win. You prove that it works. But what the Pakistanis are doing are saying terrorism will not stop us, will not terror, but we will not wait until the situation is stable, because economic backwardness is a big source of instability and terrorism, and it can be used by intelligence forces to finance extremist separatist groups and so on and so forth. So then we come to our vision of how this new paradigm, what to do with Afghanistan. Now, there are many internal Afghani things. We are not interested in micromanaging the Afghani society as the EU or the United States were doing, telling people how to dress, what to eat, how to treat their children. you cannot do this to another nation. What you can do from the outside is you offer them, you make an offer they cannot say no to. By saying, we will help you integrate your economy into this Belt and Road process. We can build infrastructure. We can help you immediately with the humanitarian problem, but if you respect us as neighbors, if you work with us on security matters, we can also help build your infrastructure. It's important for you, but it's important for us. So everybody wins. This is the win-win concept. So in that sense, we try to take ideas from different sources, including from the Afghan former foreign ministry. And also one important thing about our work is we don't play geopolitics, because there are many infrastructure projects proposed by the United States, for example, the so-called TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. The idea, and we said at the time, this will never be built because it's a geopolitical intention behind it. It's not to help people. The idea was to make sure that Turkmenistan, which has a huge gas reserve, does not work with Russia or China. So we can take the gas directly through Afghanistan and Pakistan to India, our allies, and to the international markets. And they wanted to prevent that in Iran and Pakistan and India build the peace pipeline to export gas from Iran to Pakistan and India. That was stopped too. So, but reality asserted itself, and now Turkmenistan is exporting almost all its gas to China. And the Kazakhstan and other nations are dependent on Russia to export their, so there is this geographical, in our idea that all these projects should be integrated together, not to play geopolitics, but to integrate the economies of these regions. So this is one of the ideas which with the former foreign ministry, the RECA, the Regional Economic Cooperation, I don't remember the abbreviation. Anyway, Afghanistan joined the Belt and Road in 2016. So Abdullah went to China, signed the agreement, but then nothing was done. Afghanistan also became a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to get loans for infrastructure, but that didn't lead anywhere for obvious reasons. Opposition from the West, but also the corruption inside the country. But they had very brilliant ideas for connecting the major cities of Afghanistan, but also connecting Afghanistan to its neighbors. But what you see missing in their maps is the connection to Pakistan and China. They didn't want to have that included because the Afghan government had problems with Pakistan. So now we want to remove these kinds of differences. And there's no reason why not the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline should be built. It will benefit everybody. It will ease the tension between these nations and make sure that India is working with China, with Pakistan, with its environment, rather than playing a bad geopolitical role in these. So the ideas are there, the plans are there, many agreements were signed, but they were never implemented. So that should become a priority for discussion now, not later, how the Shanghai Cooperation Organization inviting Europe and the United States to say, look, we want you here, but we want to talk about this. We don't want to talk about war against terrorism. We don't want to talk about fundamentalism or changing the culture or changing the regime. We want you to see, can you contribute to this? Can you help finance and build projects? So there should be a dialogue, a global dialogue for all these, I mean, there are also old Russian plans. We have it in our first report. A Russian academy had designed plans for connecting Afghanistan to Central Asia and Northern Siberia. We have enormous potential in Afghanistan, most importantly, the human potential, the human resources. You have 39 million people, but more than 60% are below the age of 30. People who are above 62 years in Afghanistan are only 2% of the population. Also because the longevity have gone down because of all these wars. But you have a huge young population. If they are provided with education, with the resources, the infrastructure, then they can become the most important wealth of the country. Everybody have heard about all the great minerals that are in Afghanistan, worth $1 trillion. You have the copper mines, you have iron mines, but also lithium and rare earth metals all over Afghanistan, which is true. But it is not to focus on the money, because everybody's talking $1 trillion, $1 trillion. These can actually be used as an asset to establish a bank, a national bank of development, using their natural resources as a guarantee for issuing credit for development. But that's another discussion. The United States Geological Survey did a fantastic job. This is one of the few things they did well, is they surveyed the whole surface of Afghanistan including remote sensing, satellite imaging. They had sent geologists, and they covered every part of Afghanistan to find out the minerals, the non-oil and gas minerals in the country. And this is a report, interestingly, after the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, the site disappeared, which has all the studies. You click on it, it doesn't open up, but this is the name of the study. If somebody have saved it as PDF, but it was a huge database, and that database is not available now since the United States withdrew. And these are also all the regions of Afghanistan which were studied. This is the Mes Aynak major copper mine. I will come back to it because there are certain things which we have learned from Lyndon LaRouche about physical economics which have nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with these things. There is a physical reality people have to pay attention to. For example, one of the reasons the Chinese company which took the contract for the copper mine did not fulfill the contract is because if you want to extract any mineral, especially lithium, but also copper and iron, you need huge amounts of fresh water. You cannot take the iron from the ground and sell it in the market. It's mixed with other things. You have to crush it, you have to wash it, and separate the iron or copper or lithium from that takes huge amounts of water. And Afghanistan is a dry country. It takes a lot of electricity and power. You need transport. So Afghanistan does have rivers. The problem is that most of them, they depend on snow melting in the mountains, but also they are transboundary rivers. They share it with other countries, and Afghanistan has only one agreement with Iran on transboundary rivers. They have no agreements with other countries. So nobody knows who can control the water. But also, Afghanistan receives 55 billion cubic meters of water every year through precipitation and other means. It's as much as Egypt gets in the Nile every year. But that water is spread all over the place. It's not used. So to do that, you need to build dams, you need to build management systems, all kinds of modern infrastructure to save the water and to use it in the right way. So this is one of the big problems that have to be solved. And that will help also to utilize the minerals in the country. Without water, you cannot do it. This is also interesting, showing the big disaster which was left in Afghanistan. Afghanistan produces, as I said, only 600 megawatts. That's a small power plant here in Denmark. The rest they import from other countries, mostly from Uzbekistan. But Iran, which is under harsh economic sanctions, not only produces electricity for its own people, it exports part of it to Afghanistan and exports part of it to Iraq, who have been under US and Western control all these years. It's a big irony. So all these years, nobody thought about why not build some power plants in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, in the last 5-6 years, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects produce and planned 17,000 megawatts of power. Hydropower, coal power, and including 2 nuclear reactors being built in Karachi. And everybody's attacking China, but nobody's saying anything about this disaster we have in Afghanistan. So anyway, the geopolitics of pipelines, I make jokes about it because they never happen. But if we have a new paradigm of relations, I just wanted to show this, which is the irony to understand that geopolitics don't work, geoeconomics work. The reality today is that Central Asia's major gas and oil market is China. It's not Denmark, it's not Brussels, it's not Washington. There is a physical, geographical reality which governs the new situation here. And all nations around Afghanistan, I think they have realized this, but the important thing now is to avoid that Afghanistan descends into chaos, because what you will have if the current government collapses, if you have famine, you will have, of course, refugees everywhere, but then you'll have terrorist groups taking over the country. It will spill over the neighbors, and it might have international implications. I think, therefore, I'm very sure that the neighboring countries, and there are already humanitarian aid going from China, Pakistan, Iran. I was in Iran recently. There are regular flights from Tehran to Kabul. So there is a certain normalization process going on. And all the countries now realize around Afghanistan, and I think they have plans to help normalize the situation in Afghanistan, no matter who is in government. But also, our job is to make sure that Europe and the United States, instead of cynically sitting here, hoping to see the Taliban collapse and the country go into chaos to prove the fact that the Taliban are not better than us, they should join. There's a room for atonement. There's a room for changing your way of doing things and join the new paradigm by opening a dialogue with the neighbors of Afghanistan, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and see what kind of projects the United States and Europe can contribute to. The United States, under President Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, already had many plans for development of Afghanistan, development of African nations, even China. There was a different mindset governing the policies in the United States, and people can go back to that, and Europe can go back to its humanist tradition and contribute to something to not pay for all the sins, but to create a new situation whereby these old mistakes are not repeated. So this is what I have to say so far, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to the Schiller Institute for the invitation that I accepted with enthusiasm, and with you to stay with me, talking about a subject that I'm dealing with since a couple of decades, 3 decades now, Afghanistan, that I dealt in a couple of roles. First, as Afghanistan as the main producer of narcotic crops in the world, producer of most of opium and heroin that is consumed in Western Europe. And my role at that time was the executive director of UNODC. And then, as a member of the European Parliament, I dealt again with Afghanistan as the author of the strategy for Afghanistan for the European Union. It is a report that has been approved largely by the European Parliament in 2010, and then ignored by the European Commission in the subsequent years. So Afghanistan is in my heart, not only as a student of political affairs and a sociologist, but as a country that is plenty of meaning and symbols for all of us in Europe and in the rest of the world. And last summer we had an evidence about it, in which the issue of Afghanistan seemed to become #1 priority in the world. Just to see 2 months later a complete collapse of interest about Afghanistan and all that is related to it. I'm struck these days about this radical shift of the interest in the international public opinion, both in the media and in politics, about Afghanistan. Once the last American soldiers left the country, and after almost all Western people evacuated the country, suddenly a curtain of silence went on Afghanistan. So no one, in the last 2 weeks, I read Italian newspaper, there was just one article about Afghanistan. No one now seems to be particularly interested on the subject. And this is, unfortunately, a confirmation of an attitude that we in the West have on whatever does not fit into our vision of the world. As Hussein said before, we have a completely new paradigm in the world order and in political affairs that is now showing more and more clearly one day after another. But this paradigm did not start with Afghanistan crisis. It started several decades ago, and what is happening now is just that we are being aware of this new configuration of the world. But let's go by first phase by phase. My interest in Afghanistan was about drug control. And when I got my job at the top of the UN, I thought that was the opportunity to put into practice what, as a student, I had elaborated several years before. The fact that the problem of heavy drugs, both heroin and cocaine, consumed in the West, as there is origin in the country that produce the drugs. Not only by physical, obviously, these are natural drugs that are produced elsewhere, not in Europe, but also from economic and the social point of view. So the best strategy was not to attack the problem here in the final stage of the drug trail. The best way was to go at the source. For one main economic reason, the fact that at the source the opium problem is very small in terms of economical terms. Opium issue, heroin issue, drug addiction becomes a big problem at the end of the chain. What I was always struck by the figures about heroin production in Afghanistan. 1 kilo of opium poppy is transformed, 10 kilos of opium poppy are the equivalent of 1 kilo of heroin. 1 kilo of opium poppy in Afghanistan does not cost more than $10, $20. So the price of 1 kilo of heroin in Afghanistan at the farm gate does not go more than $200, $100, $200, $300. 1 kilo of heroin here in Copenhagen costs around $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. So strategically, it was much more reasonable to intervene at the source. The farm gate production of opium poppy in Afghanistan, when I started to deal with the country, was around $100 million a year. Last year, 2020, was $350 million. All the production of opium poppy in Afghanistan. It means 90% of the world heroin. So $350 million becomes $15 billion here in Europe, and almost the equivalent in the United States. So I was not the first to think that we could drastically intervene with a very small amount of resources at the source, simply eliminating the production of opium poppy, providing Afghan farmers a viable alternative in terms of crop substitution, or we elaborate the concept, we did not speak anymore about simple crop substitution, integral economic development. I developed a plan to eliminate opium poppy in Afghanistan in 10 years. This was the year 1997. The plan was very simple. It costed $100 million, $20 million a year for 5 years to eliminate the production, 20% a year, and then another 5 years to consolidate the result. I presented this plan in Vienna to all member states, and I got a substantial approval. I remember very well, particularly Denmark and Sweden. They were the only country that pledged immediately around 10% of all the figure, trusting just the plan that we presented them. But I got a substantial okay by all member states, even by the Americans, who were at that time in very good terms with the Taliban. The Taliban in that year basically had the control of 80% of the country. They were the government of Afghanistan. And even particularly the United States told me, green light, go there. This is a country that we are not particularly interested anymore, so you can work there. We will support you, the program, and everything, even if they never believed into crop substitution. The only country that believed in crop substitutions were Northern European countries, Scandinavian countries, Italy, and Germany. They were supportive of the idea. Many other countries never supported that, either because they didn't have any idea about it, or because the Americans always supported the idea of destroying the cultivation by burning the crops. And they were always very skeptical about any alternative project. So I, at that time, the Clinton administration convinced the Americans that they should at least look the results of this program and then see. So they did not oppose it. We are talking about the unipolar moment of the world. At that time, the United States were really the only superpower on the stage. So you could never do nothing in the UN without their okay. I went to Afghanistan, where the UN had quite a huge intervention. Not only humanitarian programs, but also my program, which was a middle-sized program in the family of the UN programs, had a sizable amount of people. Particularly, we had a couple of hundred people doing the survey on opium poppy in Afghanistan. We did every year a terrestrial analysis, province by province, area by area, of all opium production. The other source were the USA government, particularly CIA, who at that time was the only owner of the satellites, who did the aerial survey of opium poppy production. Then at a certain point we clashed drastically on the results, because our people on the ground were mostly agronomists. I recruited basically all the agronomists with the agronomical degree in Afghanistan. All the local people with the other people that were around for a couple of months in Afghanistan at the time of the crop to determine with very substantial detail the production. And then you were this satellite by CIA who were very frequently wrong because they could not detect many areas in which opium poppy was cultivated into hills or into not plain areas. In this case, satellites can make huge mistakes. Or when opium poppy was cultivated with close to other crops and so on. That was a big mistake. And also there was a sample survey. They did not survey all Afghanistan. They surveyed some areas and then deducted the result with a very ample margin of interpretation. That was subject to a lot of discussion with us. Since at the end of the story they were the dominant power. Before me, I mean, there was a delegation of the CIA coming into Vienna with our experts. We discussed the result. At the end of the story, there was a kind of agreement on a middle ground on figures about what was the production of opium poppy and also of coca production in Latin America, in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The same story. I stopped this good cooperation. I said them that the party is over. Our survey is the survey that must be taken into account because it comes from independent source, which is the United Nations. The survey is funded by several countries, including the United States. And satellites are not reliable, and sometimes they suddenly changed the result. For Colombia, for instance, suddenly the result by satellite funded by the CIA and the result by the survey, ground survey in Colombia, done by us and funded by the State Department, the same American government funding and so on, diverged completely. To the point that Colombia was put in the blacklist, because of course CIA prevailed. So Colombia was put in a blacklist of countries against our opinion, the opinion of the State Department, and the opinion of all the other countries who funded the subject, that detected a decrease in coca production in Colombia that would not put Colombia in the blacklist. But, parenthesis. Then I went to Afghanistan with this blessing on my head. And I met the Taliban leaders of the time. The Taliban at the time had a prime minister that came to the meeting, and he told me at the beginning of the meeting, you want to eliminate opium poppy production in Afghanistan in 10 years. With was 250 the correct figure. Why you want to wait 10 years? You give me us 250 and we will do it in 1 year. I interrupted the negotiation and to consult with my people because I mean it was a huge thing. And then I said to him, no, it's not feasible. First, I don't have 250 million and I have to ask donors to do it. Donors will never give me $1 because of your reputation on the issue of women and on the issue of narcotics. You have no whatsoever credibility in the international community. So, first you go ahead, show that you are credible, and then I can tell you that I will do whatever is in the power of the United Nations to support you on the issue of find alternatives for the peasants. Because of course you don't want to go with using force or violence against the peasants and so on. They told me yes, they did not like the answer, they would prefer to say that. But first I told them, you have to prohibit opium cultivation, because you never did it. because they were playing with the Quran interpretation about intoxicants. The Quran, according to them, was not clear if intoxicants, which is alcohol and so on, opium was included. So we involved some big religious experts on their side, Sunni experts about Quran, who concluded, we funded also the study of these experts, and the conclusion was that opium was an intoxicant. And they did the prohibition of opium poppy. We wrote physically the law, and then they started to really say that they were going to enforce it. Then we decided that the same meeting with the Prime Minister left and the governor of Kandahar stayed negotiating with me a kind of experiment in the Kandahar area. They would eliminate opium poppy in the Kandahar area, and we would rehabilitate a whole factory who was there inactive, who were giving jobs to more than 2,000 people, women included. It was built by the German Corporation decades ago and was abandoned. Abandoned, but in a very good condition. It means that giving just electricity to this factory, we did an experiment, and the factory was working. So our proposal was elimination of opium poppy in Kandahar area and rehabilitation of the factory and jobs to the people, women included. At this point, there was a negotiation inside the Taliban, because initially they say no. Then I said, okay, goodbye. No, goodbye. Now I make a statement, and I will say that you refused to rehabilitate the factory, so to give more than 2,000 jobs to your people, because of the issue of women that would not work in the factory. At this point, the governor consulted the supreme leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, who was living just a few kilometers away. And at the end of the story, they said yes. Women can work in the factory, but in a separate area of the factory. I said, okay, no problem. But they will work in the factory, like all the others. They started to implement the agreement. At a certain point, the agreement stopped because the factory was, they told us that we started to work on the factory. They said, no, you stop the factory because we sold the factory to an investor, a foreign investor, who will take care of the factory instead of you. I said, yeah, okay, but then I discovered that the name of the foreign investor, who was a certain man coming in from Saudi Arabia, called Bin Laden, who was living just one villas away from Mullah Omar in Kandahar at the time. We are talking in November 1997. And when I went back, I told the Americans everything. I did a meeting with all donors of the program, and I said them what I'm saying you now about Bin Laden included. So no one can say that they did not know about Bin Laden and all the rest. Anyway, then we started to have a very uncertain behavior on their side in the following years, but we were pushing them continuously, maintaining always a degree of negotiation. I met them in Kandahar, I met them in Pakistan, where they had an office, an important office, and they had also another very important office in New York, where they dealt with all countries. Office made by two people, a man and a woman who was coming with jeans, blue jeans all around, a Taliban woman. I asked them, but how can you do that? If I make a picture of you now here and I send it to Afghanistan, what will happen to you? She said, nothing. I am here with a a full permission of the government. They know perfectly I am a diplomat, and I'm authorized to talk with you and with anybody else and to dress this way. Well, they started to be uncertain. In some areas, they were cooperating with us, discouraging cultivators. We, the donors, got quite disappointed and withdrew their commitment for the program. That I continued to pursue the program, but donors funded our limited program in parts of Afghanistan, funded other part of our program, but lost enthusiasm for the issue. Until the summer of 2001. In the summer of 2001, there was no opium production in Afghanistan, because they, under pressure from us, also because they wanted to recover the trust that we lost into them because of their uncertainty in the following years. I insisted also for some sanctions by the Security Council against them and so on. But we never, ever lost track with them. We always had a positive negotiating relationship with them. Also many other issues. I don't want to go into too much details. Anyway, what happened? Zero production in Afghanistan. We could not believe to our eyes. There was no production zero. Because they forbidden the cultivation in September, October, and there was not the production of opium poppy in the country. So we demonstrated that it is possible to do not produce opium in Afghanistan. Year 2001, summer, 11th of September, same year, October, invasion of Afghanistan by USA. With the full support of the international community, we gave to the United States a blank check in post-September, post-11th of September events. They invaded the country, and we are hoping that would consolidate the result. On our side, we are dealing with the drug control. So I spoke with all the State Department officials responsible for narcotics. They told me, yes, we will tell all our military that we got this huge result, also thanks to your intervention, to the United and all the rest. Be sure that this result will be confirmed in the following years. Well, what happened was exactly the opposite. Because the top American leaders, starting with the Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, they went to Afghanistan, and he personally did a set of agreements with the main warlords of Afghanistan, the enemies of the Taliban, the leader of the Northern Alliance, on fighting together terrorism, which was in large part a Northern Alliance outgrowth, in exchange, not written exchange and so on, but they put aside the narcotic issue, basically giving a de facto green light cultivation. That the next year jumped again to huge levels. Also, at the end of the same year, we had discovered by data that Russian intelligence gave us a full set of deposits of heroin on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. But there were 40 deposits of heroin for a total of 100 tons of heroin. 100 tons of heroin is the demand of all Western Europe in 1 year. So traffickers built this set of warehouses where they are stocking huge amounts of heroin. We had the picture of these deposits, and I went to the Security Council asking for an intervention. First, I spoke, of course, with the Americans and with others, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The Americans were extremely embarrassed. They did a big meeting of all the US agencies involved, and the conclusion was they would be neutral. They could not corroborate and support our intervention to eliminate, to destroy these laboratories, and they could not oppose. Because the reason was very simple, told me the State Department top, they were one man of Albright. The reason was that they could not admit that they did not discover this, that we did it. If we go to the Congress and we say that your agency, which has a $70 million budget, did this, in the Senate they will immediately ask for destroying us and all the other deal, because we spent in the area several billions of dollars in intelligence, in everything. You arrived there, how much did you pay for the... I told them that was the Russian intelligence who gave us the data, and so on, and so on, and so on. How much did you spend? I told him around $200,000. $1,000. So if I go there and I say that you, with $200,000, UN, did this, and we had no idea about this, so many people will lose their job, that the final result was neutrality. I went to the Security Council with all data, with the maps. We showed them the maps with laboratories and so on and so on. And we had several options of what to do. The simplest thing was a very simple intervention, destroying. Russians at the time had 10,000 people on the border of Tajikistan. They could do this with nothing, with very extremely small. There were lack of everything at the time. We could finance with a very small amount. I could do it also with my personal fund as director of the program. We could eliminate this like this. But of course, we need a mandate by the Security Council. Mandate never arrived because of the frontal opposition of the British. The UK said that first they told me that I should not even talk about it. When I told them that I was working for the United Nations and not for the Queen of England, they said, you will pay for that. And I paid afterwards. But the Security Council listened to all this huge presentation. UK put a veto on continuing the discussion, and everything died this way. Just to conclude the story, what we demonstrated. We demonstrated with the minimum investment of resources, with a close negotiation with the Taliban, you can get these results. We could get results again, and this is what I'm just proposed to my country. I wrote to my president, Mr. Draghi, the Prime Minister, saying that the EU, and Italy in particular, should start proposing again the Taliban to repeat what they did in the summer of 2001. Funding an alternative development program that would cost not more, doing it immediately, not in 5 years or 10 years. Now Afghanistan is not the same of 20 years ago. This can be done really in 1 year with a modest investment of less than $100 million a year, for not more than 3-4 years. The answer of my Prime Minister was, oh yes, proposal is very good, it makes sense a lot, but it's the UN who should do it. I told him, look, UN is not the world government. UN is an association of states. We are the UN. They say they will talk about it in the EU Council and all the rest. Why I'm saying this to you now? Because I believe that this is still feasible and the chances of success are much bigger now than 15 or 20 years ago. Because also Taliban are basically the same. They're not new, old, or Taliban and so on, but the same. But of course, as a government of a country, they have to deliver things. And the most important thing for the European point of view that they could deliver is the elimination of narcotic production that struck directly 1.5 million young Europeans, men and women. So this should be number one priority within a humanitarian intervention that my colleague Hussein already explained in a great detail, and that would be at minimum cost from the European Union. European Union, in my report, I demonstrated that spends every year $1 billion euros in non-military intervention in Afghanistan. 1 billion euros are enough if they get into the hand of the Afghan people. They are enough to sustain a process of change and development in Afghanistan. But the main obstacle in this case is another one. Is the fact that out of 1 billion, I discovered in the investigation I did for my report, out of 1 billion, only 20% arrives in Afghanistan. I collect all figures of member states, and it's 1 billion. But when I went to Afghanistan, and I saw the data from the Treasury and so on, the real money that arrived from the EU and so on was 200 million. I calculated that out of these 200 million, 50% end up in the pockets of Afghan minister, president, and all the rest. So to the people of Afghanistan, 1/10 of this figure arrived. You say, where is the other 80%? The 80% is what I call it the legal corruption. It is not corruption, it's waste. That sometimes is corruption, sometimes waste, and so on, which is a huge amount of money that stays in the donor area. Only EU spends between 15 and 20% of every project in consultancies. Consultancies, feasibility plan, consultants, visits, and so on. The data that they gave to me is 15%. Then you have a huge amount of waste into the channel. This money goes to some NGO who in turn put this money in the hands of another NGOs. Or then you have not only NGOs, NGOs are the best part of the story. NGOs are the best part. Then it goes also to specialized companies, technical companies and so on, who overcharge everything they do in Afghanistan. So a road that would cost 1 million is written in the books at 10 million. Whatever you do in Afghanistan is charged between 10 and 5 to 10 times its real value. A school in Afghanistan. I was in Herat, and I saw the Italian army was there. Herat was a quite safe area in Afghanistan, and so the army had nothing to do than do some social works, projects. A couple of $1 million projects that the government of Italy gave to them. And so I visited all projects. The army was outside the chain of international aid. It was an army, very simple. So I visited this, and I discovered that the school cost $100,000. An hospital cost a couple of $1 million. When I saw the books of the regular international intervention, a school cost 1 million and a hospital cost 20 million. At the time I was there, in all the country, there was just one pediatric hospital in all Afghanistan. A country at that time was less than 30 million. One pediatric hospital. And 20,000 women died for delivery every year. 20,000. So for them, the real problem was not the war. The war had a casualty much inferior to this. The real problem for them was health and so on. And I measured this huge amount of waste that must be absolutely reformed. Fortunately now, after 20 years, you have a much better program of assistance. There are international experiences that show that with this money you can have a much better effect delivering money directly, like Brazilian experiments demonstrate. Chinese experiment of poverty elimination is probably the best in the world in obtaining effect. So now the chain of delivery is improving. This is the reason why I'm saying that EU should not make any special effort for Afghanistan, should simply deliver the international aid that delivered in the last 20 years for non-military purposes in a better and more efficient way. Narcotics is just one part of it, not the biggest, and for sure, this can be a very strong argument of a negotiation with the Taliban. I can guarantee you that on a table of negotiation with the Taliban, putting on the table the recognition of the government and a serious program of international aid, government will capitulate on the issue of women. I'm sure, because I know them. The issue of women for them is, and I don't like this of course, is just the subject of negotiation. They do it to raise the price of negotiation. They know perfectly what we think about them and women. They know perfectly what we think. And they do for purpose these restrictions policy on women. Because they know that this is an issue very hot for us that they can, on which they can extract power, money, and recognition. But this is an operation that must be done. What is the other way? The other way was described by Hussein. Not doing nothing, let the country starving, people continue to die, Taliban collapse, and they gain instability, terrorism, and violence, and whatever Afghanistan got in the last 40 years, returning on the stage. It's not very difficult to make this prevision. If the Taliban collapses, the country goes again into a complete chaos. And it is possible to talk with them. They are extremists, they are not, normal people. They won an independence war. They are radicals. It's natural. You never saw a movement that fought for 20 years, arriving to power and being like a government of Denmark. People project on the Taliban the government of Denmark, tolerant, inclusive, respective of everybody's right and so on. These people, I met these people. They fought for 20 years with a Kalashnikov, a cup of tea and a piece of bread. Now they have power. And they don't, the issue is if they are not helped, if they are not pressed, they can make mistakes. They are not up to the job. This also is quite normal. When I went to South Africa, after the end of apartheid, immediately after the big war for apartheid, the government of South Africa was made by people absolutely incompetent. I have to say, I always have been supportive of their fight since the beginning and so on. So I went there with the big idea about it. I went to Soweto. The first thing I did, go to Soweto, and I saw a terrible situation. Terrible. Soweto was plenty of violence, drug consumption all over and so on. I talked with all the ministers and so on, and they were totally inadequate to their job. They had a very vague idea on what to do, because they were fighters. They were not administrators. And this process, transforming fighters into administrators, is very long, difficult, that many other countries did, with different results. Algeria is another example of a total failure. Liberation movement that took power against a very strong colonial power, that was France. And the result was that they were incapable of building a modern Algeria. They are still trying to build it. So these are difficult processes that should be understood before launching sentences and judgment and all the rest. Maybe I have to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arlacchi. And I appreciate why Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the international president of the Schiller Institute, proposed that the Western countries should make you a special representative for Afghanistan to have a common approach of how to do this thing. And in that connection, I was just reflect as a Dane. You say that when you first set up the program, Denmark was one of the main sponsors, you know, doing above its share of funding how to get rid of narcotics. It's very ironic that later we find the Danish troops being deployed in the Helmand province under the leadership of the British troops and going around year after year after year doing the fighting, while the poppy seeds, I think the numbers it was going up by a 30-fold during this liberation from British and Danish troops. And therefore, when the Danish government right now is sitting, thinking through what went wrong, they could actually go back to what we did then and say, we have a moral obligation to do this right again, and what better way than helping out directly, funding and contributing to such a program of saying, now we want to get rid of the poppies and we want to instead to have real economic development. But that's just me as a Dane reflecting on this. Now I would like very much to give the word to His Excellency Ahmad Farouk, the ambassador of Pakistan to Denmark.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much to the Schiller Institute for organizing this event on a very important issue, the future of Afghanistan and which way we would like it to move forward, and for giving me this opportunity of presenting Pakistan's perspective on this subject. So what I have to say would not be the kind of story which Professor Arlacchi just narrated, and it was more enjoyable, especially due to his Italian gestures. But I would like to begin with just to put some context into what now Pakistan feels should happen with regards to Afghanistan, with a bit of history of how we we see this situation has evolved over the last 40 years. Because Afghanistan has been in a state of turmoil for 40 years, and not much is said that the conflict actually started in 1979 and not in 2001. And Pakistan, along with Afghanistan, has been facing its fallout for the last 40 years. The withdrawal of the Soviet troops in 1988 was followed by a civil war that took place between the different factions of the Mujahideen that were fighting the Soviets. And a key reason for that to happen was that once this objective of expelling the Soviets from Afghanistan was achieved, the West decided, and the US, they decided to walk away from Afghanistan. And if they had stayed there and had supported the peace-building process in that country, perhaps the history of that country would have been much different. And from this chaos of the civil war, we saw Afghanistan descend, into the top drug-producing country in the world. It became a safe haven for the international terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in particular, and organized crime that was going on there. And the Taliban basically, they emerged from this chaos of the civil war with the promise of bringing stability and peace to the country. What we remember, however, from their rule is more, the kind of human rights violations that were committed, especially against women and girls. And in the period that followed the September 2001 attacks, Afghanistan did make progress, at least from the outside, one can say. But obviously, as both Professor Arlacchi and Hussein, the facts that they have presented, actually, there were serious problems that were that remain unresolved. The conflict continued to linger, and the country faced serious challenges in terms of bad governance, corruption of the various Afghan governments. The fact that there was never a clear exit strategy for the international community to come out of Afghanistan is basically what played a role in what we see today, and the fact that we were not able to achieve long-term peace in the country despite the presence of such a large international military presence, despite the fact that, as it is claimed, $2 or $3 trillion were spent in the country. And basically, it's eventually, in the last 2 years, the US came to this realization that there is no military solution and they have to get out of Afghanistan. So at that point, they decided to talk to the Taliban. Pakistan had been advocating for a long time, from the period when Al-Qaeda had ceased to be a threat as a terrorist entity, that there was a need for a political process, a dialogue in Afghanistan, because there could not be any military solution there. The Afghans, if you look at their history, they have never succumbed to any foreign military pressure. So the Taliban were a political reality, and the Americans needed to talk to them. So eventually, when the Americans decided to talk to them, Pakistan did play its role in facilitating the dialogue process. However, we also advised them that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has to be accompanied in tandem by progress in the peace process. So once a withdrawal date was set, and which was not connected with the progress in the peace process, the prospects of a political solution faded. The ultimate collapse of the Afghan security forces without putting up a fight and the fleeing of the former President Ashraf Ghani and his associates has basically brought us to where we stand today. The 4 decades of conflict in Afghanistan, my figures may be a bit different from what Hussein presented. We believe over 1 million Afghans have been killed, injured, maimed, traumatized, and it has basically resulted in destroying the polity and the economy of the country. So the people of Afghanistan, they desire peace, they desire development, and so are Afghanistan's neighbors, especially Pakistan. Pakistan has a very long and complex history in terms of our relations with Afghanistan. And the last 4 decades have particularly been the most difficult. The two countries are linked inextricably through ties of geography, history, ethnicity, religion, and culture. And most importantly, Pakistan provides Afghanistan its lifeline. Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and most of its international trade takes place through Pakistan, as we have a transit trade agreement with them. Over the last 4 decades, Pakistan has hosted over 3 to 4 million refugees. Several generations of Afghans have grown up in Pakistan and have not ever seen their home country. So no matter what happens in Afghanistan or whoever is in control of the country, it has serious ramifications for Pakistan. We do not have that luxury of walking away from that situation as has been done by the West twice. For us, it has also been a compulsion that whoever is in control of Afghanistan, we have to have some kind of a working relationship with them. We cannot simply, because when you look at the situation, if the trade of a country is going through Pakistan, we have a long border with them. There are people who have ties, tribal, who are belong to the same tribe. They are crossing over. So all that requires that we have to have a functional relationship with the government, whether it's de jure or de facto. Now, in the entire duration of this 4 decades of conflict, Pakistan has been the country that has, after Afghanistan, which has been the most affected by this conflict. In the initial period of the war, we had to suffer the weaponization of our society. We were affected by drugs coming in. We were affected by the pressure of the refugees, because when they came in, it was not only the fact that they had to be housed, but they eventually, with such large number of people coming in, they destroyed our ecology, especially in the area where they were living in huge camps in those days. And then, following the September 2001 attacks, the conflict, which was previously restricted to Afghanistan, was brought to within our own borders, as Pakistan became the battleground for the fight between terrorist groups. So over these last 20 years, we have suffered casualties of almost 80,000 and economic losses of over $150 billion. The return to normalcy has been achieved at great cost, both in terms of the lives that we've lost as well as treasure, and that's what our government and our people want to preserve. After now these decades of instability, Pakistan wants to focus on its economic development, and a key aspect of that is regional connectivity. We want to reach out especially to the countries of Central Asia, to meet our energy needs, for promoting trade and attracting international investment. The Prime Minister of Pakistan has recently outlined a policy of geoeconomics for the future of Pakistan rather than focusing on geopolitics of what we had been doing in the past. And a peaceful Afghanistan is the centerpiece of that. Without peace in Afghanistan, it is not possible for us to achieve the economic progress that we desire for our future. Any continued instability in Afghanistan, obviously in the shape of, if God forbid, Afghanistan descends into a civil war, Pakistan will be the country, and perhaps our other neighbor, Iran, which will be most directly impacted by it in terms of terrorism and the spillover of refugees. We continue to host over 3 million Afghan refugees, and as I mentioned before, and we provide sustenance to them through our own resources, because the international assistance for the upkeep of refugees dried up somewhere in the early 90s. The Afghan refugees can access our health services, our educational institutions, our banking system, and they can earn a livelihood. The fact that in this last 20 years, when supposedly there was so much of money that was being poured into Afghanistan, and there was no civil war, none of these refugees decided to go back to Afghanistan. So if there had been any attraction for them, they would have left and gone back to their home country, because despite the fact that they are able to earn a livelihood in Pakistan, they still don't, even for the children that have been born in Pakistan, they don't enjoy Pakistani citizenship. They remain Afghan citizens. So they would have gone back to Afghanistan if the situation there had presented them a better option. So now, as we move forward, Afghanistan stands at a critical juncture, and the Afghan people, with the support of the international community, can definitely build a better future for them. Learning from mistakes of the past, we've seen now what happened in 1988, and again the fact that the West has decided to leave Afghanistan. It should not mean that they abandon Afghanistan, and because that will obviously prolong the conflict and cause suffering for its people, which will not be to the benefit of anyone. The recent humanitarian statistics, statistics about the humanitarian situation which are coming out from different UN agencies are quite alarming. So, as per UNICEF, 18 million Afghans are in urgent need of assistance, and over 1 million Afghan children can suffer serious malnutrition and starvation in the coming months. So it is important to prevent this situation from deteriorating any further, because that will create a huge humanitarian disaster that will affect not only the region, Afghanistan itself, but the region and other areas as well of the world. Pakistan believes that it is important that we should provide access to Afghanistan's financial resources in order to prevent a further deterioration of the economy of the country. It is also essential to prevent inflation, rising prices, growing poverty, and preventing a mass exodus of refugees from the country. On our part, Pakistan, we are playing a role in terms of assisting the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. And together with UN agencies, we have developed an air bridge through which emergency supplies are being now airlifted to Afghanistan. That includes food and medical items. Pakistan itself has dispatched 3 plane loads of emergency equipment, especially medical supplies, to Pakistan, and we are continuing to do so, especially food aid, through the land corridor. This fact was recently acknowledged by the visiting US Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman. She was in Islamabad on Friday. She appreciated that and acknowledged that and encouraged Pakistan to continue doing that. We are also, in terms of the overall political environment, in consultations with all the neighbors of Afghanistan, including China, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and also Russia, in finding a long-term peaceful solution for the country. We continue to call on Afghanistan and the Taliban to form an open, inclusive governmental structure that practices moderate and sound policies with regards especially to the human rights and ethnic groups, women and children. Terrorism, since we have been a major victim of terrorism that has emanated from Afghanistan, so that remains for us a major concern. And so we have been calling upon Taliban that they should not allow the use of their territory by the various terrorist groups that are present there. Pakistan is also part of the extended Troika format, so that includes China, Russia, the US, and Pakistan is the 4th country in terms of finding the political solution options for Afghanistan. I believe, as my other co-panelists have said, this is a time where the international community has to apply a different approach for bringing peace in Afghanistan. Military options have been tried and they have failed. So we have to look towards how we can help Afghanistan develop economically, and there has to be an engagement and incentivized approach, as Professor Arlacchi also mentioned, in encouraging the Taliban to do what we expect of them. So in conclusion, I would once again like to thank the Schiller Institute for organizing this very important debate. And indeed, we would like to continue working with you in finding answers. And at the end, I would just like to state that the national poet of Pakistan, his name is Iqbal, and the Iranians know him as Iqbal Lahori. He said somewhere in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, about Afghanistan, that Afghanistan is the heart of Asia. So that's where the name of that political process, Heart of Asia, Istanbul process, comes. If there is peace in Afghanistan, there is peace in Asia. And if there is unrest in Afghanistan, there will be unrest in Asia. Thank you very much.
from our Zoom audience, we have a message from Helge Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder and chairman of the International Schiller Institute. And she writes, "Please tell the seminar that the Schiller Institute plans to have a day of action internationally this coming Thursday, demanding the release of the funds." In other words, the Afghanistan government funds that are right now being frozen in the United States and other countries since the Taliban came to power. And she continues, "Maybe if other forces around the world would join this, it will make the demand stronger." The following is a statement by the representative of Iran's embassy in Denmark to the Schiller Institute seminar on Afghanistan. The representative of the embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran at this seminar, whilst emphasizing the need for an inclusive government, respect for civil and democratic rights of all citizens without discrimination in Afghanistan, highlighted the important role the neighboring countries can play in helping peace and security to be established in the country and alleviating the sufferings of its people. He pointed out that with terrorist activities in the region and with drug production in Afghanistan reaching record levels, the security and law enforcement forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the past 4 decades have been constantly engaged in combating terrorism and drug smuggling along its 900-kilometer border with Afghanistan, and have suffered casualties in their efforts to close off this route for drugs reaching the West. Throughout this period, Iran has also hosted millions of Afghan refugees, estimated to have peaked at 4 million, accommodating and providing them with health and educational services on par with that afforded to its own population, including COVID-19 vaccination. This has been a heavy burden on Iran, given the fact that, contrary to other refugee host nations, the country has received little or no assistance from the international community. With the recent developments in Afghanistan, an influx of new refugees from that country, expected to reach 500,000, is already taking place, and Iran, with its ability to help new arrivals hampered by the heaviest sanctions under the U.S. maximum pressure campaign, is doing all it can to help its Afghan brethren, while cooperating with the UN agencies to help address the problems facing the people of Afghanistan. In one important move, the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, with due regard to the importance of providing education for Afghan refugee children, called on the Iranian authorities to register, free of charge, Afghan children at Iranian schools alongside their Iranian brothers and sisters. Finally, the Islamic Republic of Iran considers the active involvement of all Afghanistan's neighbors paramount in any moves towards addressing these issues, and is willing to continue to play a positive role in the efforts to achieve goals desired and shared by all Afghans.
The ability of terrorists and separatist groups to be active and recruit people is dependent on the fact that there are frustrated people in that community. It's not that only frustrated because of political oppression, they're frustrated because their government is not offering them anything. And therefore, all these, this so-called war on terrorism has been a failure because it does not address the real needs of those societies by, for example, building infrastructure, providing healthcare, education, work for people. I mean, we have now the whole sub-Saharan Africa region. NATO, France, the United States, they have hundreds of military operations in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is that the regular armies of these nations, like in Mali, in Niger, in those countries, first of all, they were devastated by what happened in Libya, because there were massive amounts of weapons and militants moved from Libya into their countries. But the other thing is that those nations are not capable of paying their own security forces and soldiers, because the economy is in such a bad shape. So Boko Haram, for example, they have more resources than the government to finance fighters and recruit young people who are angry and frustrated, because they get lots of resources from the smuggling of cocaine to Europe, or they have sponsors in certain countries. So the ability of a nation to fight terrorism is actually very much dependent on its ability to sustain its economy and build a strong military and security response. But you cannot, I mean, you have in some cases, the population, it's not the military and security forces who will defeat the terrorists. It is if the population is on your side, which can help you defeat it. If the population is against you, then everything you do in terms of military or security will not work. I mean, we have many cases, like even in Iraq and other areas, where the population starts supporting these groups instead of the government because they are so frustrated with the government, and the government is destroying their livelihood. So I think it should be a lesson from now on that in order to be able to solve the problem with terrorism, I mean, if you have a legitimate government in that country, you have to support that government with economic aid, not only with military and security aid.
I can add to that. The United Nations has what is known as the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which is every 2 years renewed by the General Assembly. So it's based on 4 pillars, and one of the pillars is addressing the underlying causes of terrorism. So within that, addressing the economic sort of deprivations is one of the reasons that has been identified. So it's a document which is it's a consensus document agreed by all members of the United Nations. So it's a very important aspect of why people, not everybody is just ideologically motivated to join terrorist groups. There are economic deprivations which also cause people to join them, as we have experienced in our part of the world, that the terrorist groups perhaps offer better wages that people could find, if they're unemployed or they are unable to meet their living expenses. So they offer good money, like a monthly wage to their members. So,
Really?
yeah.
They even offer retirement and, the victims, I mean, the family of a killed terrorist,
yeah.
They will also get support, so they can recruit more. The problem is that the failed security policy of the United States, for example, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, actually, they helped recruit more people by bombing civilians and killing, people in weddings and funerals. So the angry people who see that, they would naturally join the militants rather than join the United States war against terrorism.
Yeah. This is a crucial point. Crucial point. Probably the most important one. The international terrorism, since 5 years, is decreasing drastically. Is more than 50% decrease of international terrorist attack and dead. Huge. Pakistan has 80% decrease in terrorism attack. Iraq, huge decrease. And also other countries had huge decreases. So no one of the so-called official experts on terrorism predicted this. Everybody was talking about an escalation of terrorism. So at a certain point, 5 years ago, year by year, huge decrease. Why? The connection with the decision of the USA administration to withdraw troops and to de-escalate intervention, aerial bombing in the Middle East, particularly Syria, particularly Iraq, and Afghanistan as well, is the most obvious explanation that no one advanced, because it is very difficult, it's unpolitical, not politically correct, to say that most of this international terrorism is a reaction of the wars in the Middle East. Why Italy was not bombed? And France was bombed. No, we got between 2015 and 2016 a set of terrorist attack in Europe, concentrated France and Belgium. Almost 300 people died. So last year the Economist wrote an article saying why Italy has never been affected by international Islamic terrorism since 20 years. We never got it. And the explanation was because of the mafia. Because they say that the mafia forbidden international terrorists to bomb Italy. So I wrote a letter to the Economist. They published it, and I said that the idea of a mafia is very stupid because the mafia is busy now to try to survive, and they never got this power to impede terrorism. I mean, they cannot care less about terrorism in Italy and so on. The real reason is that we never bombed Syria. We never bombed Iraq, never bombed Afghanistan. Italy, Germany, Scandinavian countries never bombed anybody. But I mean, there is a reason why in Scandinavia the only serious terrorist attack was by a crazy guy from the extreme right years ago that killed 15 people. Why they don't do it? There is a clear reason that Italy never been bombed. It would never in the past. Because Germany got just one small terrorist attack at Christmas 3 years ago. Never. Because Italy, Germany, and Scandinavian countries never participate to aerial bombing in the Middle East. We never use troops to combat on the ground and so on. When people are killed, these people are not animals. These people have affects, have families, have somebody who of course resent this. You cannot continue to bomb a country. They did 5,000 aerial attacks in Syria, killing in Afghanistan, killing people in weddings, killing people indiscriminately in funerals. and so on. With this aerial bombing, modern and old, and so on. So the reason why internet is also now you will see these statistics that all American statistics. I am quoting the best source, the most the widespread source is the University of Maryland database on terrorist attack. The next year, since the Taliban were considered terrorists, wrongly, the decrease that I'm quoting will be 80%. There will be just, if you take out the Middle East route of terrorism, in the rest of the world, there are very few examples now of active terrorist groups. Africa, Mali terrorists. Mali terrorists was largely increased by the French intervention. Now they decided to withdraw all their troops because they realized that they were increasing terrorism instead of Somalia. The same was this reckless intervention of foreign troops, particularly the Americans, that created this reaction. This is a fact that is I'm saying, very obvious thing. 20 years ago, the Pentagon was not afraid of saying that. I read a very important document of the Pentagon who said it is our overextension in the world that is creating this reaction. So terrorism is largely a threat that has been created by this. And the best way, sometimes they ask me, what is your recipe to fight terrorism? Because I played some role in fighting the mafia in my country. Well, what is your recipe to fight terrorism? Simply, don't bomb countries. Stop bombing. Stop bombing. And you will see how terrorism will decrease.
I just want to say on that note, of course, that Denmark has been the subject of terrorist attacks for the very explicit reason that Denmark, since 2001, under Anders Fogh Rasmussen, has been under, he used to be, before he went to be head of NATO, he was Prime Minister of Denmark, Anders Fogh Rasmussen.
Yes.
And started doing it, was already going a little bit, but having as a stated policy, this militaristic foreign policy, that if there is a war where bombs are being thrown, then, especially in Middle East, Denmark, of course, should be in there throwing bombs. So we have been bombing in Libya, we have been bombing in Syria, we have been bombing away. So Denmark is the exceptions to this peaceful tranquility.
You got many international Islamic terrorist attacks.
We've had, compared to
people dead or just
Denmark is a very homogene country, but there's been quite a few that also, there's been some successful and some that has been stopped for this reason. And therefore that should just be saying what you said, should be obvious when in Denmark there is this process of trying to discuss what should be the policy forward for Denmark, that the first thing I think everybody should agree on is this militaristic foreign policy, this idea of intervention with military means has to stop. Peacekeeping troops, like Denmark, like other Scandinavian countries used to do in Cyprus and many different places, that's very good.
Peacekeeping operations.
Peacekeeping troops, but that's a totally different matter. That is to prevent war.
Nothing to do, yes.
So anyway.
UN is, unfortunately, UN is out of the picture. That was a decision that Kofi Annan took. When Afghanistan was invaded, there was a big discussion at the top of the UN what to do. And Kofi and a group of others decided that we should stay away. The argument was that they invaded the country, they have to take care of the country, should not drop to us the issue like they used to do. When they have a difficult issue, they drop it to the UN. So we should not play this game. Now they take care of the country. My position and the other position was not, did not agree that UN should be on the ground to avoid the occupation that at that time was very popular. The first moment of the Afghanistan invasion, there was a very large consensus all over the world on that. But we were afraid that as any occupation of a foreign country end up the same way, badly. So just to prevent what really happened afterwards, we had to be on the ground with a big force. And we also planned to strengthen our presence in Afghanistan with a special force, UN force and so on. And at that time we could also get the support of the member states. But Kofi and the others insisted on us playing a minimum role, staying away and so on. They prevailed, well, Secretary General, you know, prevails all the time. And nothing happened. Now would be the moment. It could be the moment for the UN to step in. But this is a question that we should raise with the Secretary General. The UN could play a big role in reconstructing Afghanistan and talking with the Taliban, that were always in contact with us. We never lost contact with the Taliban. Why do not be at the forefront of that?
I think you know, as you had mentioned in your comments, that the UN is also, it's like an association of states. So its policies, its agenda is driven by, it's state driven, and within those states there are certain states that, you know, have to take the lead, which includes the US, you know, the permanent members of the Security Council, or also, you know, when it comes to the development side, the European Union. So unless they take the lead, because they are the ones who are going to foot the bill, the money has to come from somewhere. So unless you know, they take the lead, the UN on its own cannot move. It doesn't have the resources.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, there was a shift in the 90s to replace the United Nations with what we have now. It has evolved into what the people in the West call rules-based order. That has nothing to do with the United Nations Charter or international law. These are rules created by powerful institutions and military-industrial complexes and think tanks in the West. Prime Minister Tony Blair in 1997 started that process in his speech in the Chicago University, where he said, the era of the Peace of Westphalia, which established the fact that nations are sovereign and independent, is over. That's an obsolete principle, because we, the civilized world, the democratic free world, should have the right to determine if a dictator is legitimate or not. If he's oppressing his people, we should have the right to intervene with military means to change that leader or that government. So then we had the whole series of the 9/11, post 9/11 wars, Afghanistan, and then the worst case was Iraq, because the United Nations was against it. But then the Americans and the British said, well, we will go our way then. So in that sense, they wanted to demolish the United Nations Charter, the role of the United Nations, not as a world government, but as a forum where nations can agree and meet and agree on very important issues as independent sovereign nations and prevent war and establish peace. Now, there is a move by China and Russia to, I think it's called the Friends of the United Nations, of the UN Charter, because they say we should go back to the United Nations Charter, which has actually its roots in the Peace of Westphalia Treaty. that nations are independent and sovereign, that nations should work together to establish peace and prosperity everywhere. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need just to go back to the UN Charter and international law established on that basis. And this is what these people who have launched all these wars and the economic and financial interest behind them, they want perpetual war. It's like a perpetual revolution, where there is no rule except the rules they set according to their interests and desires. And that's very, very dangerous. And therefore, going back not to the UN as a world government, but the UN Charter and the principles which were established after World War II, that would guarantee. I mean, even the question, our friends raised the question of sanctions, that economic sanctions, indiscriminate economic sanctions should be forbidden internationally, because in every single case, they both created massive suffering for the population, and they did not force these governments to change their policies. I come from Iraq, we had in the 1990s, we had criminal sanctions where we lost 500,000 children. And State Secretary of Madeleine Albright said, well, that's a reasonable price to control Saddam Hussein. Well, you didn't change Saddam Hussein's behavior. He was changed with a military invasion, which removed him by force. But the sanctions did not make the Iraqi government change its policy. It's the people who suffered. We have a generation of young people whose development is stunted, who are easily manipulated. They can very easily join terrorist groups and militias and so on. So this idea, also this using economic sanctions against nations, this should also stop, not only launching wars on fake basis.
The substituting war.
I think, as far as China and Pakistan are concerned, once there is peace in Afghanistan, and the corridor could be expanded to Afghanistan, it would have significant peace dividends for the regional countries. But the primary issue here is that you need a government in Afghanistan that is recognized internationally. And unless that happens, you cannot expect international investment to start pouring into the country. As I mentioned in my comments, for us and China, because China is the country that has launched this Belt and Road Initiative. So they see the future of their economic progress in regional integration. And we also, as I highlighted, that our Prime Minister has come up with this vision of geoeconomics. So that is based on regional connectivity. And within that, Afghanistan is in the middle of everything. As Hussein mentioned, this gas pipeline that was planned from Turkmenistan and ending up in India cannot be built if there is no peace in Afghanistan. So similarly, the prospects are there, but we need to have a set of conditions on the ground that allow that to happen. And Pakistan is we see it as part of our future growth, that we integrate regionally through Afghanistan with countries in the Central Asia.
We can deploy the Taliban to protect the infrastructure construction companies. In Iraq, for example, because everything in Iraq was destroyed, but only oil production was protected. Now, they brought international security firms, Blackwater, Sandlines, which is the British, the Aegis, and those companies' major job was to protect the production and transport of oil from Iraq. And they succeeded. So that kind of infrastructure was allowed to succeed, protected by mercenary troops, by very well-paid mercenaries. But you can deploy the Taliban fighters, who are very good fighters, to protect the infrastructure projects which are proposed to be built. And also because they know the local community. Because you know, terrorist groups don't come from a very far area to attack a certain. They need to have what you call incubator. I mean, I know I lived in northern Iraq in Kurdish area, and when I was like 10 years, there was the Kurdish Iraqi, there was like civil war. And the Kurdish fighters will descend in the evening into the city and attack the posts of the security and police people, and then they would disappear. Now, the road to the mountains is very far. But what they used to do is that they had collaborators in the city who will hide them.
They disappeared.
Yeah, so unless you have the population on your side, you cannot fight terrorism and separatist groups. And therefore, I think in the case of Afghanistan,
It's a good idea, very good idea.
you should deploy the Taliban, pay them a good wage
Very
to
good idea.
protect vital economic interest of the nation in their local areas, not to move them away, because they need to be near their families. And to protect that kind of economic projects would be in the interest of their own families, and therefore they would be more serious protecting it. And in addition, they can get a wage. And then the rest of the youth you can deploy like President Franklin Roosevelt did after the Great Depression. They had these special, it's called the CCC, special camps for unemployed people. They get professional training. Even if they don't have any skills, they are sent to work on what they did in the United States in environmental conservation, because most of the trees were cut and land was degraded. Planting trees, doing things, and those people will learn a skill while they get paid a wage, a limited wage. Most of it will go to their families, and then they keep the rest as pocket money. While they're on these working camps. We can have a modern version of that for people who want to immediately need to repair the roads, bridges, and all these things. So therefore you can recruit lots of young people in these smaller projects right now to repair the roads and bridges and water and so on. And at the same time they will get some income, but they learn the skills which they will use later when the big infrastructure projects come in with the foreign investors. So there are ways to tackle these things, but you have to work locally. You have to also care for the people of that country.
And just what Helga Sepp-LaRouche says, exactly for that reason, this issue of actually restoring the sovereignty of Afghanistan, releasing the funds that they have around the world, which actually is absolutely needed right now, simply to buy to have energy, to have all of these things, is clearly a very key part of it, that this has to be done. You can't just say that this is going to be a permanent non-country, because then you can't do anything.
You have the UN program for drug control, who has 40 years experience in alternative development and drug eradication. We accumulated this experience in all parts of the world, so we know what works and what does not work. But in the case of Afghanistan, a comprehensive program today cannot be done like 30 years ago. A full involvement of the government is absolutely indispensable. My proposal is to create a special agency, national agency, Afghanistan National Agency, that use experts coming from the UN, coming from the donor countries, in order that ownership of the program, of eradication program, and alternative development belong to the government. We cannot work like 20 or 30 years ago, in which we did everything. We just told the government of Afghanistan what to do, not only the government of Afghanistan, other governments. We, in many cases, abused our credibility. We still have huge credibility outside the West. But we used sometimes to abuse it. In this case, I see no counter-indication in creating a special, not diluting the issue of narcotics into a general program of agricultural development, having always a particular pocket in order to do not lose the target, which is basically a Western target. People believe that Afghanistan, when you land in Afghanistan, you see poppies here, poppies there, with this brilliant color everywhere and so on. The poppy cultivation in Afghanistan is very difficult to see in a map. I had always problem for that. It is so small, it's 0.5% of arable land. It is so small, you cannot see in a map. It's not like people believe that all countries plenty of poppies and so on. It's not that way. It is cultivated in particular areas, not, very frequent, not easily accessible, and more remote areas. And even in the areas like Helmand province, where you have almost 50% of the production, it's not easy to see poppy cultivation. They're very small vis-à-vis the rest of the agriculture. So the main interest on narcotics is our interest, because the drugs comes from there. So if you want to close the tap of drugs, natural drugs, in Europe, you have to be there and do what is necessary to do. With the goal of elimination, because there are also other proposals, sometimes quite bizarre, like there was a proposal years ago to use, to permit opium cultivation and use all opium cultivation of Afghanistan for legal medical purposes, which sounds fine. The problem is that all the legal demand for opium is always satisfied by 3 countries that are authorized by the UN, heavily controlled by the UN, and are enough to supply all the codeine that is necessary for the medical industry all over the world. There is no shortage. You have already Australia, India, and Turkey, who produce, under UN authorization, what all legal opium derivate that is necessary. Every year, countries send a questionnaire to the International Narcotic Control Board, who is a special narcotic board of the UN, quoting his demand for his hospitals, for his treatment of terminal patients, and so on. This body elaborates all this demand and assigns to this country a certain quantity of legal, is codeine, the main derivative for, and that is it. If there is an increase, they immediately authorize Tasmania area in Australia, where most of it is produced, Turkey and the other country, to increase production, which is done in a way that works perfectly. There's no diversion to the legal market. Today now opium also, technology improved a lot, is extracted directly from the plant, and so on. So the system works. Why transform drug cultivation in Afghanistan in a supply of unnecessary drugs to bodies that do not require them? First. Second, how do you control that? How do you control that? A production of a couple of 100,000 hectares scattered, as I told you, scattered in little pieces, controlling it will cost 10 times the production of opium poppy. So this is an idea that floated for a while because some prominent intellectuals advanced a couple of years ago, then it died. other wrong ideas to buy the product from the peasants. The Americans tried to do it in Southeast Asia 30 years ago. This is simply to encourage cultivation. I mean, if you want, if you pay a peasant to cultivate, the following year there will be 2 peasants to cultivate. Because of, they start from the evaluation, it is very cheap to buy opium cultivation at the source. The original idea is not wrong. It's so cheap that instead of paying billions of dollars against the organized crime, against paying and treating the addicts in the countries of destination, is of course $200 million at the source, and you finish it. It's not so. It never worked. Never worked and never was seriously applied because it is not possible to apply. I mean, today for me it is possible with a very modest investment, but avoiding mistakes of the past. We learned a lot, but because sometimes we supported wrong ideas, like also to fund the peasants, not controlling the diversion to legal crops. There have been many errors. And now we develop this idea of the integral development. We are not obliged to do crop substitution. If you have a good industry that can transform other materials, why don't? Why don't? Afghanistan, for instance, plenty of opportunities in this area. If there is an area where there is a mineral, why insist on funding alternative development crops? Why crops? You can also have many other alternatives to crop substitution. Talk with the Taliban, treating them as winners, as they are. They are winners. When you read, yes, if they have to come here and then no, it's not that way. You cannot treat them as losers. They won an independence war against the biggest army in the world, with nothing in their hands. And they know that. They have to be treated as winner. As winner. Then, and with humility and with respect. First thing, which is, in my opinion, the most important of all. If you treat them with the respect they deserve, you will get from them whatever is necessary to get. Starting with women. But if we treat them as primitive, as sauvage, that just are there because who knows why, as bloodthirsty primitive people, you get nothing from them. They immediately close and say, who you are, to tell us how to treat our women, how to treat our country, who you are. This is the reaction you get. This is the most important thing to deal with the Taliban. They won, and they're legitimate winner. So start to treat them this way. Why you have to tell them how they should do their government? The government should be inclusive. What does it mean, inclusive? What does it mean, inclusive? I mean, you should establish how many Hazaras, how many Tajik and minorities should be in the government. I mean, this is difficult to do even in the West. If you should start to really respect all ethnic composition of countries, it's very difficult. No, the Taliban should do it since the beginning. I mean, that irritates them a lot. They will, because they won also with the cooperation of not Pashtun. There are also many Hazaras and others who are in the coalition. There are Taliban, Hazaras, and Azeris, and so on. But it's up to them. It's an internal issue that you cannot establish from outside. How much inclusive should be a new government? I mean, when we won the Second World War, we had big problems in establishing governments all over Europe. And the Taliban showed a degree of responsibility that is absolutely admirable. They did not do vengeance killings all over Afghanistan, which I expected to see. After the Second World War, Nazi collaborators, fascist collaborators in Europe got killed 10, 15 years after the war. In Italy, we had an extension of vengeance killings related to the war that ended up in the 50s. I mean, hundreds of killings. Things are also very complicated in the war. There are innocent people also killed, and so on. But the minimum accusation that you were a collaborator of Nazis, of fascists, condemned you to death. And we still have cases. After 70 years, we still about it. So a civil war with that ferocity has consequences that can last very long. They did an amnesty. They did not did vengeance against anybody. They did not punish state employees who were working with the former government. There was no blood around. And they did the amnesty for all of them. So, I mean, these are things that show a degree of responsibility. Then I told you, they are not normal people. I mean, they're radicals, extremists with a very strange mentality that you have to understand and respect. Then, but they're also flexible. They're not stupid at all. They're flexible. If you put on the table the right thing with the right attitude, this is the first thing. Right attitude. You can get from them whatever you think it is necessary. Starting with the issue of women. They were always very, very flexible. Then newspaper, you see that girl or that school in that part of Afghanistan is close to women and so on. This is not fair. They always had the problem to control also their movement and also their country. When I was there, we had almost every day problem with the Taliban extremists, crazy, that were destroying TV set and so on. But this was not absolutely a widespread phenomenon. There were phenomena of intolerance, of women oppression and so on, but you cannot really generalize and from one or two cases make a big fuss. You have to measure the situation on the ground with a different attitude, and you will get the results. Their main interest is to survive and to govern the country that has no state structure. They have no money. They have no tax collecting. They don't know how to collect taxes. They don't know. It's their main problem. The humanitarian emergency, and so on. So, in my opinion, if you go with them, with talking to them as human beings, and also winner of a long war, and respect them, I mean, you can get from them what is necessary. Why? They should be crazy to do not accept a serious proposal. But no one does it. No one. EU started in a good way, Borrell and the others saying that we were to talk to them and so on. Then they stopped. You have to talk to them, but with the proposal in mind, with the right attitude, treating them as they deserve, and you will get what you want from them. They are not against. They were Philo-Americans until they are the heirs of Mujahideen. They are not communists. They're nothing. They are just nationalist, religious people, in a Muslim way. I mean, with a degree of also internal tolerance and contradiction, like us Catholics and so on, that is remarkable. It's remarkable, and go and do this. But, I mean, public opinion in my country was paralyzed for 3 months, talking or not talking with the Taliban, which is the most stupid thing. You must talk with them.
So
Sorry.
I think
Sorry.
the idea of doing politics through military means has clearly failed. So that means that diplomacy has to take over, and the key idea of diplomacy has always been to put yourself in the place of the other. See things from the way they see it.
Try to see what
And if
they
you do that and you simply talk together, history has shown there's hardly anything that cannot be solved. But it also means that exactly doing this is not something that's in a certain sense decided on the ground in Afghanistan. This is especially the question of shifting this paradigm, this way of thinking in the Western world. In countries like this country, like here, like Denmark, which has been part of the problem for quite some time, despite its tradition, suddenly jumped into this, yes, we'll do this militaristic foreign policy and we're doing humanity a great favor. That has been totally disproven. Now the question is exactly having this shift in the Western world and saying, that failed, now let's be responsible, let's do the other thing. And I think this call that Helga said, was it on Thursday? We had this day of action, is exactly this. How do you show that you now will respect Taliban as a country? Not as subjects, not as some subjects you can tell what to do, but say, okay, you have your country, you run your country, we collaborate with you. The first thing is, of course, to recognize it as a country.
Absolutely.
And give them the rights to actually deal with their deposits and whatever. And then say, I mean, even a country like Denmark, I mean, the problem is water, the problem is food, is there something we can do to help these things? Of course, there's an enormous amount. Europe has enormous skills. The US Army, of course, has enormous skills, but I don't know if that's the best thing to throw into that. But so can these problems be solved?
Recognizing the government, first of all, recognition.
So,
I mean, they won, they control the country. But Europe recognized a person in Venezuela, Mr. Guaido, who had not the support even of his wife, recognized by 50 countries, like this. A person who does not control nothing. I mean, we should be even more coherent and serious in what we do in foreign policy. Respecting basic rules, who control territory, population, must be recognized, period.
So we are coming to a close. So I want to thank the speakers again for coming here and enlightening us. And I think it's a very, as I said, time is of the essence here. It's very important to move very fast on these things. So it's very important to move the discussion in whichever way is possible. So thanks for coming, and also the rest of you, very much thanks for coming, and make sure the discussion moves as ring in the waters from here.